Echoing like a gunshot across the manicured patio of the Oakdale Country Club, a heavy leather loafer connected with bone. A sharp, breathy yelp followed, instantly swallowed by a low, dangerous, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very flagstones. Sneering down at the massive German shepherd he'd just kicked, Richard adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke blazer. "Shut that filthy mutt up!" He spat to no one in particular, fully expecting an apology and a cowering owner to rush over. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the clubhouse blew open so violently the glass shattered in the frame. As she walked in, the room went dead silent. She didn't yell or cry, but the cold, dead-eyed, calculated look on her face promised one undeniable truth. Richard had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Oakdale, Virginia, was the kind of neighborhood where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was weaponized. The lawns were uniformly cut to exactly 2.5 inches. The hedges were geometric perfection, and the neighborhood association, led by Richard Belmont, operated with the ruthless efficiency of a small dictatorship. Richard, a corporate litigator who viewed every interaction as a deposition, ruled the cul-de-sacs alongside his wife, Cynthia. They thrived on order, predictability, and the quiet submission of their neighbors. Then, Vera Jenkins moved into 402 Sycamore Lane. There was no parade of moving trucks. There was no housewarming party. Late one Tuesday evening, a matte black Chevrolet Tahoe backed into the driveway. Vera emerged a tall, lean woman in her late 30s with a faded scar cutting through her left eyebrow and eyes that seemed to constantly scan the tree line. She didn't look like an Oakdale resident. She moved with a strange, liquid economy of motion, carrying heavy Pelican cases into the house single-handedly. But what caught the neighborhood's attention wasn't Vera. It was the shadow that stepped out of the Tahoe behind her. He was a German shepherd. But he didn't look like the show dogs Cynthia Belmont paraded around at the local park. This animal was massive, easily 90 pounds of coiled muscle, with a dark sable coat and a face heavily graying around the muzzle. His left ear had a notch missing, and a thick, hairless scar ran down his right shoulder. When he stepped onto the driveway, he didn't sniff the grass or pull on a leash. He didn't even wear a leash. He stepped out, pressed his flank against Vera's left leg, and sat down. He didn't look at the squirrels. He looked straight down the street, his amber eyes tracking a slow-moving delivery truck with unnerving focus. His name was Kaiser. To the Belmonts, Vera and Kaiser were an immediate affront to the neighborhood's aesthetic. Richard watched them from his bay window the next morning. Vera was out in her backyard, drinking coffee. "Look at that beast," Richard muttered, sipping his espresso. "It looks like a junkyard dog. I give it 3 days before it tears up Mrs. Gable's flower beds. I need to check the HOA bylaws on breed restrictions. She didn't even wave when I drove past yesterday," Cynthia added, adjusting her silk robe. "And I heard from the realtor that she paid in cash. Who pays for a house in Oakdale in cash? No corporate job on file either. Just listed her occupation as consultant." If Richard had known what kind of consulting Vera did, he might have kept his mouth shut. Vera was a recently retired senior chief petty officer. For 12 years, she had been attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group SEAL Team 6 as one of the military's premier multi-purpose canine MPC handlers. She and Kaiser hadn't just done tours. They had survived the kind of classified, high-stakes kinetic operations in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Syria that never make the evening news. Kaiser wasn't just a dog. He was a veteran who had cleared explosive-rigged compounds, taken down fleeing insurgents in the pitch black of night, and taken a piece of shrapnel to the shoulder to shield Vera from a blast. But to Richard Belmont, Kaiser was just a nuisance waiting to happen. The friction began quietly. Richard started leaving passive-aggressive notes on Vera's door regarding the length of her grass. Vera ignored them. Then, Richard tried to confront her during one of her morning runs. It was a crisp Thursday morning. Vera was jogging at a brisk, punishing pace, wearing a weighted vest. Kaiser trotted off leash, exactly 6 inches from her left knee, never deviating. Richard stepped out to the edge of his driveway, holding up a hand like a traffic cop. "Excuse me, Miss Jenkins." Vera didn't break stride immediately. She tapped her thigh twice. Kaiser instantly dropped into a rigid sit, freezing like a statue on the pavement, while Vera jogged in place, turning to look at Richard. "Can I help you, Mr. Belmont?" she asked, her breathing barely elevated. "The neighborhood has strict leash laws," Richard said, puffing out his chest. "I'm the HOA president. You can't just have a massive, dangerous-looking animal roaming free. There are children here. There are property values to consider." Vera looked at Richard, then down at Kaiser. The dog was staring a hole through Richard, completely motionless, awaiting a command. "He's under voice control, which is an exemption in county law. Provided the dog is a trained service or working animal," Vera said, her voice flat, devoid of the deference Richard was used to. "I don't care what the county says. This is Oakdale," Richard snapped, stepping closer. "And he looks aggressive. If he steps one paw on my property, I'll have animal control take him. Do you understand me?" Vera stopped jogging. She stepped slightly in front of Kaiser, a subtle shift in her posture that made Richard instinctively take a half step back. "Mr. Belmont," Vera said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "Kaiser has more discipline in his left paw than most men have in their entire bodies. He won't step on your lawn. Minus Mr. Belmont, but I strongly advise you not to make sudden moves toward him. And never, ever raise your voice at him again." She clicked her tongue. Kaiser stood up, and the two resumed their run, leaving Richard fuming on the asphalt. He pulled out his phone, his face red with indignation. Nobody spoke to Richard Belmont like that. He was going to make it his personal mission to get that dog and its arrogant owner thrown out of his neighborhood. 3 weeks passed, and the tension in Oakdale thickened like summer humidity. Richard Belmont had escalated his campaign against Vera. He'd filed noise complaints, which were instantly dismissed by the police, considering Kaiser was practically mute. He'd tried to petition the HOA board to ban German Shepherds, a motion that stalled when Vera's lawyer, a heavily connected military advocate, sent a single, terrifyingly polite cease-and-desist letter outlining federal protections for retired military working dogs. Richard's ego was bruised, which made him dangerous. But while Richard was focused on a petty suburban turf war, Vera and Kaiser were focused on something else entirely. The Belmonts were preparing for their annual summer solstice gala, a lavish backyard event meant to show off their newly renovated patio and pool house. To handle the catering, lighting, and valet parking, Richard had hired a private, high-end event company from out of state. For 3 days, vans rolled in and out of the Belmont driveway, dropping off tents, tables, and equipment. On Wednesday evening, Vera was sitting on her front porch, cleaning a piece of intricate leather tactical gear. Kaiser was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws, seemingly asleep. A white transit van pulled up to the Belmont house across the street. 3 men got out. 2 of them were young, carrying lighting rigs. The third man, the supervisor, stepped out of the passenger side. He was broadly built, wearing a tight black polo shirt, with a thick beard and eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the fading light. The moment the man's boots hit the pavement, Kaiser's eyes snapped open. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. But his ears pinned forward, and the fur along his spine, his hackles, stood up in a razor-sharp ridge. He rose to a standing position, his body rigid, his nose twitching as he pulled scent from the evening breeze. Vera noticed instantly. She stopped wiping the leather. "What is it, buddy?" she murmured. Kaiser let out a sound so low it was more of a vibration than a noise. It was his alert vocalization. In Helmand Province, that specific sound meant someone was carrying concealed ordnance or that a tripwire was strung across the path ahead. It was a sign of immediate, concealed danger, Vera's eyes locked onto the supervisor across the street. The man was directing his crew, but his head kept swiveling, his gaze lingering entirely too long on the security cameras mounted on the Belmont's eaves, then scanning the neighboring houses, including Vera's. He wasn't looking at the architecture, he was calculating sight lines. Vera stood up. "Bleib," she whispered, stay in German. Kaiser remained frozen, tracking the man's movements. The next morning, the pattern repeated. Vera took Kaiser for his morning walk. As they passed the Belmont driveway, the supervisor, whom Richard had loudly referred to as Greg, was unloading boxes. As they drew near, Kaiser suddenly stopped. He stepped in front of Vera, blocking her path, and let out a sharp, guttural bark. It wasn't a warning to Vera, it was a direct challenge to the man. Greg jumped, dropping a box of extension cords. He looked at the dog, a flash of genuine, wide-eyed panic crossing his face before it smoothed back into a scowl. "Keep that thing away from me, lady!" he yelled. Richard Belmont came storming out of his front door, holding a travel mug of coffee. "What is going on here? Miss Jenkins, I told you to control that animal." Vera kept her eyes on Greg, who was quickly retreating toward the van. She shortened Kaiser's invisible lead with a hand signal. "Mr. Belmont," Vera said, her tone deadpan but urgent, "where did you hire this crew?" "That is none of your business," Richard snapped. "They are professionals from Elite Event Solutions. Now get your vicious dog off my property line." "Kaiser isn't vicious, Richard. He's trained," Vera said, taking a step closer, lowering her voice. "He doesn't alert to delivery men. He doesn't alert to your landscapers. He is alerting to him. My dog was trained to sniff out threats and read hostile intent. I'm telling you, as a professional, there is something wrong with your contractor. You need to run a background check on him right now." Richard threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Are you out of your mind? You're using your untrained, aggressive mutt as an excuse to harass my staff because you're bitter about the HOA fines? Let me make this clear, Vera. If your dog barks at my workers one more time, I won't call the HOA. I will call the police. And I will press charges for reckless endangerment." Vera stared at Richard for a long, heavy moment. She looked at the arrogance puffing up his chest, the complete blindness of a man who had never faced real danger in his life. "Suit yourself," Vera said quietly. She tapped her leg. "Kaiser! Foos!" The dog snapped to her heel, and they walked away. But Vera didn't go back to her morning routine. She went straight into her home office, booted up a secure laptop, and made a phone call to an old friend who worked as an analyst at the FBI's regional field office in Quantico. "Hey, Marcus," Vera said when the line clicked. "I need a favor. I need you to run a facial recognition scrub on a guy working a gig in my neighborhood. Goes by Greg. Drives a white transit van with Delaware plates. You think he's a problem, Vera?" the voice on the other end asked. "I don't think," Vera replied, looking out her window at the van. "Give me 24 hours, Marcus said. But they didn't have 24 hours. The Belmont's gala was the next afternoon. The Oakdale Country Club served as the overflow venue for the Belmont's massive Saturday afternoon gala. Because Richard's guest list had swelled beyond the capacity of his half-acre backyard, he had rented the club's sprawling stone patio for the pre-dinner cocktail hour. The entire neighborhood was invited, a mandatory appearance for anyone who didn't want to face social exile. Vera had absolutely no intention of going, but earlier that morning, she had received an email from the HOA board demanding her presence at an emergency mediation session regarding her dangerous animal to be held in the club's side office just before the gala kicked off. It was a blatant power play by Richard, forcing her into his domain on his biggest day. Vera dressed in a simple dark blazer and jeans. She brought Kaiser. The HOA rules technically allowed dogs on the club premises if they were secured in the shaded pet tethering area just off the main patio. A small courtyard enclosed by a waist-high wrought iron fence. When they arrived, the patio was already buzzing with caterers and early guests. The event crew, led by Greg, was rushing back and forth between the club's kitchens and the patio. Vera walked Kaiser to the tethering area. She knelt down, looking into his deep amber eyes. "Blibe," she commanded softly. She didn't use a leash. She simply unclipped his heavy tactical collar from his neck, leaving him completely bare. For a dog like Kaiser, the command was stronger than any steel cable. He sat down in the shade, motionless, watching her back as she walked into the clubhouse. Inside the side office, Richard was waiting with two nervous-looking HOA board members. For 20 minutes, Richard droned on, presenting a litany of fabricated complaints about Kaiser's aggressive posturing. Vera sat in silence, her phone vibrating in her pocket. She ignored it, letting Richard exhaust his vocabulary of legal threats. Outside, the patio was filling up with wealthy residents sipping champagne. In the tethering area, Kaiser sat perfectly still. He ignored the poodles yapping from a distance. He ignored the smell of seared scallops wafting from the kitchen. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, monitoring the environment. Then, he saw him. Greg emerged from a side service door near the back of the clubhouse. He wasn't carrying catering trays anymore. He was wearing a heavy, dark, canvas backpack that looked completely out of place at a high-end cocktail party. He looked over his shoulder, his face slick with sweat, and moved quickly toward the club's main electrical room, a secluded area that controlled not just the lights, but the security cameras and electronic locks for the entire building. Kaiser recognized the scent of the man. But more than that, his military training kicked in. The dog recognized the adrenalized sweat of a human in fight-or-flight mode. He recognized the furtive, tactical movement. Kaiser stood up. He walked to the edge of the wrought iron fence, his eyes locked on Greg. As Greg reached for the handle of the electrical room, Kaiser let out a bark. It wasn't a normal dog bark. It was the terrifying, concussive roar of a 100-pound apex predator sounding an alarm. The sound ripped through the polite chatter on the patio like a chainsaw. Guests gasped, spilling drinks. The string quartet stopped playing. Inside the clubhouse office, Vera heard the bark. She stood up instantly, knocking her chair backward. "Sit down," Richard shouted, his face purple. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. That beast is ruining my event." Richard stormed out of the office before Vera could stop him, pushing through the glass patio doors. He was blinded by rage, seeing nothing but the dog that was humiliating him in front of his peers. Greg, startled by the bark, had abandoned the electrical room door and was fast walking away, disappearing into the crowd. But Kaiser remained at the fence line, barking furiously, his eyes tracking the space where the man had been. Richard marched straight up to the tethering area. He didn't see the warning signs. He didn't see the dog's pinned ears or the rigid posture. All he saw was an animal disobeying his aesthetic rules. "Shut up!" Richard screamed. Kaiser ignored him, turning his massive head to bark again in the direction of the fleeing contractor. Richard, losing whatever shred of rational thought he possessed, unlatched the small gate, stepped into the enclosure, and drew back his foot. Wearing a heavy, steel-shanked designer loafer, he kicked Kaiser square in the rib with all his might. The heavy thud of leather on bone echoed across the patio. Kaiser let out a sharp, breathy yelp, stumbling sideways from the force of the blow. The entire patio went dead silent. The guests froze in horror. Kaiser recovered his footing in a fraction of a second. The military dog didn't retreat. He didn't cower. He turned to face Richard, his lips peeling back to expose a terrifying array of teeth, including a gleaming titanium canine. A low, demonic growl started in his chest, vibrating the air. He was a microsecond away from tearing Richard Belmont's throat out, but he didn't, because he was trained. He held his ground, waiting for the command to strike. Richard stepped back, suddenly realizing the magnitude of his error. his face draining of blood as he looked into the eyes of a killer. Then, the heavy oak doors of the clubhouse blew open. The glass panes in the frame rattled violently. Vera Jenkins walked onto the patio. The guests parted for her like the Red Sea. She looked past the wealthy neighbors, past the spilled champagne. She looked like a soldier walking into a combat zone. Vera, Richard stammered, raising his hands. His previous bravado entirely evaporated by the sheer, deadly aura radiating from her. He wouldn't stop barking. Higher, Vera snapped. Kaiser instantly stopped growling, spun around, and trotted to Vera, pressing his flank against her leg. Vera stopped 2 feet in front of Richard. The silence on the patio was deafening. "I told you," Vera said, her voice a lethal, quiet whisper that carried across the stones, "never to touch my dog." Before Richard could formulate a defense, Vera's phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She didn't break eye contact with Richard as she pulled it out and hit speakerphone. "Vera." Marcus's voice crackled from the FBI field office, echoing in the dead quiet of the country club. "Get out of there. The guy in the van, Greg, his real name is Thomas Vargas. He's wanted for a string of armed, high-end jewel heists across the East Coast. He uses event crews as cover to disable security systems and lock down the venues. He's not catering, Vera. He's hitting the club." The color completely vanished from Richard's face. Vera slowly put the phone back in her pocket. She looked down at Kaiser, then back up at Richard. "You kicked my dog for warning you," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Now, get on the ground, Richard, before they start shooting." Richard Belmont stood frozen, his designer loafers rooted to the imported flagstones. His brain, wired for courtroom objections and corporate loopholes, simply could not process the raw, kinetic reality crashing down around him. He stared at Vera, then down at the dog he had just assaulted, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "Shooting? Down. Now." Vera didn't yell, but the sheer, concussive force of her command hit him harder than his own kick had hit Kaiser. Before Richard could comply, the heavy glass doors of the club's main lobby shattered outward. It wasn't an accident. It was the precise, deafening crack of a short-barreled rifle firing a warning shot into the ceiling. Panic, sudden and absolute, erupted on the patio. Women in silk sundresses screamed. Men in tailored blazers shoved each other blindly, scrambling for the manicured hedges. But there was nowhere to go. 2 men, dressed in the same black polo shirts as the catering crew but now wearing heavy tactical vests over them, stepped out from the side service alleys. They held compact CZ Scorpion submachine guns, sweeping the barrels over the terrified crowd. "Nobody moves. Get on the ground. Face down. Hands on your heads," one of the gunmen roared, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the stone courtyard. Richard's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the patio, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known existed. He looked around wildly for his wife, Cynthia, who had been inside near the champagne fountain. Vera didn't drop to the ground. In the chaos of the screaming crowd, she moved backward, slipping into the shadow of the heavy stone archway near the pet tethering area. She tapped her thigh once. Kaiser didn't need to be told. The massive German shepherd instantly dropped into a low crouch, practically flattening his 90-pound frame against the stonework, melting into the darkness beside her leg. His amber eyes were locked on the gunman, but he didn't make a sound. The military working dog knew the difference between a warning bark and a combat situation. This was no longer an alert. This was an ambush. Inside the main ballroom, Thomas Vargas, the man Richard knew as Greg, stood atop the mahogany grand piano. He had shed his catering disguise. A matte black plate carrier was strapped over his chest, and a customized AR-15 rested easily in his hands. He fired another round into the ornate chandelier. "Ladies and gentlemen of Oakdale," Vargas announced, his voice carrying a terrifying, calm authority. "Welcome to your own gala. All exits are magnetically sealed. The security cameras have been looped. The local police dispatch is currently dealing with 3 simultaneous, anonymous bomb threats on the other side of the county, which means no one is coming to save you anytime soon." He gestured to 2 of his men, who began moving through the cowering crowd with heavy canvas duffel bags. "Watches, rings, wallets, and the diamond necklaces I know you all pulled out of your safes for today," Vargas instructed. "Do exactly as I say, and you get to go home and file an insurance claim. Try to be a hero, and your spouse wears black to your funeral." Outside, pinned behind the stone archway, Vera assessed the geometry of the battlefield. 4 shooters visible, 2 inside, 2 outside. They were disciplined, maintaining overlapping fields of fire. They weren't street thugs. They moved with the tight, coordinated efficiency of former private military contractors. Vera looked down at Kaiser. His ribs were bruised from Richard's kick, she knew that much. But the dog's breathing was slow and measured. Adrenaline was flooding his system, dulling the pain. He looked up at her, waiting. "Okay, buddy," Vera whispered, reaching down to unclip the heavy leather tracking harness she carried on her belt, slipping it over his head and securing the cobra buckles. She didn't have her Sig Sauer. She didn't have her vest. She was wearing jeans and a blazer. But she had Kaiser, and right now, he was the deadliest weapon in the zip code. The 2 gunmen on the patio were systematically herding the outdoor guests toward the main ballroom doors, forcing them inside to consolidate the hostages. Richard Belmont was crawling on his hands and knees, weeping openly, his pristine blazer smeared with dirt and spilled wine. One of the gunmen, a tall, heavily tattooed man, noticed Richard lagging behind. He stepped forward, raising the butt of his rifle to strike the lawyer. "Move it, rich boy," he snarled. He never finished the sentence. From the deep shadows of the stone archway, 40 feet away, Vera gave the command. It wasn't a yell. It was a sharp, hissing whisper that cut through the ambient noise like a razor blade. "Fass." It was the German command for bite. Kaiser didn't run. He launched. 90 pounds of apex predator cleared the distance in a blur of sable fur and terrifying silence. He didn't bark to announce his presence. The military had trained that out of him years ago. The gunman only had time to turn his head as a shadow eclipsed his peripheral vision. Kaiser struck him center mass. The sheer kinetic impact of the dog moving at 30 miles per hour hit the man like a speeding truck, lifting him clean off his feet. The CZ Scorpion clattered across the flagstones. Before the man even hit the ground, Kaiser's jaws locked onto his right triceps, the titanium canine sinking through the tactical fabric and deep into muscle. The man let out a blood-curdling scream, thrashing violently. The second outside gunman whipped around, raising his weapon toward the dog. But Vera was already moving. Using the distraction, she sprinted from the archway, closing the gap in 3 devastating strides. As the second gunman leveled his sights on Kaiser, Vera dropped her shoulder and drove her elbow perfectly into the side of his knee. The joint gave way with a sickening pop. As the man crumpled, Vera pivoted, driving the heel of her palm upward into his jaw, snapping his head back and rendering him unconscious before he hit the deck. She snatched his dropped submachine gun from the air, checking the safety and chambering a round in one fluid, practiced motion. She leveled the weapon at the first gunman, who was still pinned beneath Kaiser, screaming and bleeding. "Aus," Vera commanded calmly. "Out." Kaiser instantly released his grip. He didn't retreat. He stood over the sobbing, terrified mercenary, his jaws hovering inches from the man's throat, a low, rumbling growl starting in his chest. Richard Belmont, still on his hands and knees just feet away, stared at Vera. The woman he had harassed, belittled, and threatened with legal action was now standing over 2 neutralized armed robbers holding a submachine gun with the cold, detached efficiency of a professional killer. "Vera," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. My wife is in there." Vera didn't look at him. She was scanning the shattered doors leading into the ballroom, her mind calculating the variables. "Keep your mouth shut, Richard," she said softly, and dragged these two behind the hedges. "If they wake up, hit them with a rock." She looked down at her dog. "Good boy, Kaiser." "Foos," the dog snapped to her heel. Together, they bypassed the main doors, slipping silently into the country club's sprawling commercial kitchen. It was time to dismantle Vargas's crew from the inside out. The kitchen was empty, the catering staff having fled or been dragged into the ballroom. Stainless steel prep tables were covered in half-finished hors d'oeuvres. Vera moved with absolute silence, communicating with Kaiser entirely through hand signals. A flat palm meant stop. 2 fingers pointing meant search. Kaiser's nose was working overtime. He bypassed the overwhelming smells of truffles and seared meat, isolating the sharp, distinct odor of gun oil, synthetic canvas, and adrenalized sweat. He stopped at the swinging doors leading to the service hallway that ran behind the main ballroom. He locked up in a rigid point, his nose directed at the narrow slit between the doors. Someone was standing right on the other side. Vera pressed her back against the stainless steel wall. She held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. She kicked the left door open. A mercenary guarding the hallway spun around, raising his rifle. But he was looking at eye level. He wasn't looking down. Kaiser swept under the swinging door like a low-flying missile, targeting the man's lower extremities. He clamped onto the man's calf, executing a violent twisting motion taught to take down fleeing insurgents in the dark. The man's legs went out from under him, his head cracking hard against the tile floor. Vera stepped through the door a second later, zip-tying his wrists before he even realized what had hit him. 3 down. 2 left. Inside the main ballroom, the atmosphere was suffocating with terror. 50 of Oakdale's wealthiest residents were huddled on the floor. Cynthia Belmont was sobbing silently, clutching a string of pearls in her trembling hands. Vargas paced the front of the room, checking his tactical watch. He pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece. "Bravo, report. Status on the perimeter? Static. Charlie, report. More static." Vargas's calm facade cracked slightly. He gripped his AR-15 tighter, his eyes darting toward the main doors. "Delta, go check the kitchen. Now." The remaining mercenary nodded, moving tactically toward the rear service doors. Vargas stepped down from the piano, walking toward the hostages. He grabbed Cynthia Belmont by the arm, hauling her to her feet. She shrieked in terror. "Someone is playing games!" Vargas yelled, aiming his rifle at the ceiling. "I want the vault codes for the club's safe, and I want them now, or the HOA president's wife catches a hollow point." Behind the heavy double doors of the service hallway, Vera could hear the panic escalating. She knew Vargas was adapting. He had realized his men were gone, and he was barricading himself with the hostages. A direct assault through the doors would result in civilian casualties. She looked up at the ceiling. The Oakdale Country Club had been renovated 2 years ago, boasting an intricate, massive HVAC system with reinforced, oversized ductwork to cool the sprawling ballroom. She looked at Kaiser. "You ready for a drop, buddy?" Kaiser let out a soft whine, wagging his tail once. He lived for this. Vera bypassed the service doors and led Kaiser up the back stairwell to the club's mezzanine level, picking the lock to the mechanical room. She pried open the heavy steel grate of the main return vent. It was easily large enough for her and the dog. "Delta!" Vargas's voice echoed through the vents, sounding frantic now. "Where the hell are you?" Delta was currently unconscious, tied to a meat slicer in the kitchen. Vargas was entirely alone. Crawling through the dark, galvanized steel ductwork, Vera positioned herself directly over the ballroom's central decorative grate. Below her, through the slats, she had a bird's-eye view of the room. Vargas was standing in the center, using Cynthia as a human shield, his rifle sweeping the doors frantically. He was perfectly positioned directly under the vent. Vera unholstered the captured CZ Scorpion. She couldn't shoot. The risk of overpenetration hitting a hostage was too high. She needed to separate Vargas from Cynthia. She unclipped Kaiser's heavy tactical tracking lead, creating a makeshift lowering line. She looped it securely through the reinforced D-ring on Kaiser's harness. She stroked his head once in the pitch black. "Trust me," she whispered. With a vicious kick, Vera shattered the decorative grate beneath them. It crashed down into the ballroom, shattering a dining table directly to Vargas's left. Vargas flinched, shoving Cynthia away and swinging his rifle upward toward the ceiling, aiming at the hole. He expected a SWAT team. He expected flashbangs. He did not expect a 90-pound, highly trained attack dog to drop from the ceiling like a terrifying, furry spider. Vera lowered Kaiser on the heavy nylon lead, dropping him a full 10 feet before letting go of the line. Kaiser hit the ground with the heavy grace of a panther, rolling once to absorb the impact. Before Vargas could even pull the trigger, Kaiser launched himself upward. This time, the dog didn't go for a limb. He went for the weapon. Kaiser's jaws clamped down on the handguard of the AR-15, forcing the barrel toward the floor just as Vargas fired. The deafening crack of the rifle sent a bullet harmlessly into the hardwood. The sheer momentum of the dog tore the rifle completely out of Vargas's hands, sending it sliding across the ballroom floor. Unarmed and panicking, Vargas pulled a tactical knife from his belt, slashing wildly at the dog. Kaiser dodged backward with supernatural agility, barking furiously, keeping the mercenary cornered and entirely focused on him. Vargas lunged at the dog, raising the knife. "Drop it!" Vargas froze. He slowly turned his head. Vera was standing in the shattered double doors of the ballroom, the CZ Scorpion leveled perfectly at the bridge of his nose. She looked completely unfazed, a terrifying avatar of control amidst the chaos. "Drop the knife, Vargas," Vera said coldly, "or I let the dog finish what you started." Vargas looked at the barrel of the gun. He looked at Kaiser, who was crouched low, his titanium tooth gleaming in the ambient light, practically begging for the command to strike. The knife clattered to the floor. Vargas slowly raised his hands, dropping to his knees. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of sirens finally wailing in the distance, growing louder as the police realized the bomb threats were a diversion. Vera kept her weapon trained on Vargas. "Kaiser," she commanded softly. "Higher." The massive dog backed away from Vargas, keeping his eyes on the target until he was safely pressed against Vera's left leg. He sat down, rigid, awaiting his next order. From the back of the room, Richard Belmont stumbled through the broken doors, covered in dirt, his face pale as a ghost. He ran to Cynthia, holding her as she sobbed. Slowly, Richard turned his head to look at Vera, and then down at the dog he had kicked less than 30 minutes ago. The dog that had just saved all of their lives. The wail of police sirens, initially a distant hum, rapidly crescendoed into an overwhelming, ear-splitting scream that surrounded the Oakdale Country Club. Red and blue strobes pierced the shattered windows of the main ballroom, casting violent, chaotic shadows across the terrified faces of the hostages. Vera Jenkins didn't relax. The arrival of law enforcement was often the most dangerous phase of any hostage situation. In the eyes of a highly adrenalized SWAT team breaching a building, anyone holding a weapon was a target. "Richard," Vera barked, not taking her eyes off Thomas Vargas, who was still kneeling on the hardwood with his hands raised. "Get the guests down flat against the far wall. Away from the windows. Now!" Richard Belmont, his custom-tailored suit in ruins, didn't argue. He didn't cite HOA bylaws. He scrambled across the floor, physically grabbing his weeping neighbors and pulling them toward the heavy oak wainscoting. "Get down. Everyone, stay low," he yelled, his voice cracking but surprisingly steady. Vera ejected the magazine from the captured CZ Scorpion submachine gun. She cleared the chamber. catching the live round in the air, and placed the weapon deliberately on the floor, kicking it 10 feet to her right. "Kaiser." "Platz," she commanded. The massive German shepherd immediately dropped into a flat, prone position beside her, his chin resting on his paws. He was a coiled spring, his eyes darting toward the strobing lights, but his body remained perfectly still. "Vargas," Vera said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "If you drop your hands, if you twitch, I will not wait for the police. I will let the dog take your throat. Not if you understand." Vargas, staring at Kaiser's bared titanium canine, nodded slowly. Sweat dripped off his nose. Seconds later, the main doors of the clubhouse were blown open with a concussive blast that shook dust from the rafters. A 6-man tactical team poured into the room, assault rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the smoky air. "Police! Nobody move! Show me your hands!" the lead officer roared. 3 laser dots instantly settled on Vera's chest. She didn't flinch. She slowly raised her hands, palms open and visible. "I am unarmed!" she shouted back, her voice cutting through the panic with military precision. "Shooter is on his knees, center of the room!" 3 more hostiles restrained in the kitchen and the patio. An aggressive, young SWAT officer rushed forward, zip ties in hand, aiming his rifle directly at Kaiser. The dog's ears pinned back, his throat emitting a low, warning rumble. He didn't like the aggressive posture directed at his handler. "Don't aim at the dog!" Richard Belmont suddenly screamed from the back wall. He stood up, placing himself in the officer's line of sight. "She's a veteran. That dog just saved my wife's life. The guy on his knees is the terrorist." The SWAT commander, a grizzled lieutenant named James Harper, held up a fist, halting his men. He looked at the shattered ceiling vent, the disarmed assault rifle on the floor, the terrified but unharmed hostages, and finally at Vera, who was radiating an eerie, combat-hardened calm. "Secure the suspect," Harper ordered, pointing at Vargas. 2 officers tackled the mercenary, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. Harper approached Vera, lowering his weapon slightly. "I had help," Vera said, lowering her hands and tapping her thigh. Kaiser instantly rose to a sit, leaning his heavy head against her hip. For the next 2 hours, the manicured grounds of the Oakdale Country Club transformed into a chaotic staging area of flashing red and blue strobes. The pristine, imported flagstones were now covered in discarded medical wrappers, crushed champagne flutes, and thick black cables snaking from mobile command units. Paramedics moved methodically through the triage zone, treating minor lacerations and the profound, shivering shock that had taken hold of Oakdale's elite. Richard Belmont sat heavily on the diamond-plated rear bumper of an idling ambulance. A thick, foil shock blanket was draped haphazardly over his shoulders, mirroring the one wrapped around his wife, Cynthia, who leaned against him, staring blankly at the ruined clubhouse. Richard wasn't looking at the building. He was watching Vera. Vera Jenkins stood just inside the yellow police tape, bathed in the harsh glare of a portable halogen floodlight. She was speaking quietly with SWAT Lieutenant James Harper, a 20-year veteran whose face was etched with deep lines of exhaustion. At Vera's feet, Kaiser lay in a relaxed down stay, rhythmically lapping water from a collapsible canvas bowl Vera held in her palm. The dog's ribcage, bruised from Richard's boot, rose and fell in a steady, calming cadence. To look at him, one would never know he had just neutralized a heavily armed mercenary crew. The FBI field office just confirmed Vargas's identity and ran his associates, Lieutenant Harper said, scrubbing a hand over his jaw. He looked down at the dog, a profound respect in his eyes. "They've been hunting this crew for 18 months, Chief Jenkins. They specialize in high-net-worth targets, exploiting private event staff credentials. They hit, they hold, they empty the digital accounts in the physical vaults, and they vanish. You handed us the East Coast's most wanted on a silver platter." Harper paused, looking back at Vera's stoic expression. "I don't know whether to arrest you for extreme vigilantism or petition the mayor to give you the key to the city. Give the key to the dog, Vera replied flatly, wiping a fleck of dried blood from her cheek. I just followed his nose, Lieutenant. He dictated the tactical geometry. Well, whatever they fed him in Devgru, it worked, Harper muttered. Suddenly, the heavy, metallic slam of a police transport van's doors drew their attention across the parking lot. Thomas Vargas, his hand shackled to a heavy leather waist belt and blood crusting above his right eyebrow, was being forcefully guided up the metal steps of the armored paddy wagon. But as the officers pushed him forward, Vargas suddenly braced his boots against the step, resisting the shove. He turned his head, locking eyes with Vera, across 50 yards of chaotic parking lot. He didn't look defeated. The arrogant, jagged smirk that spread across his face sent a sudden, icy shard of warning straight down Vera's spine. You think you won, military? Vargas shouted, his voice hoarse but carrying easily over the rumble of idling diesel engines. You think you outsmarted me? Vera's posture instantly stiffened. Beside her, Kaiser stopped drinking. You interrupted my timeline. Vargas laughed, a desperate, unhinged sound that made the hairs on the back of Harper's neck stand up. I wasn't done in the electrical room. Why do you think I needed the doors magnetically sealed? If I go to federal lockup, this whole snobby zip code is going up in smoke. Harper's heavy radio, clipped to his tactical vest, suddenly shrieked to life, the dispatcher's voice tight with panic. Command! This is Perimeter Sweep Team Charlie. We have a severe anomaly in the clubhouse's main breaker room. Suspect left a rigged Pelican case. Lieutenant, it's wired directly into the commercial gas main. I repeat, device is tied to the main gas line. The blood completely drained from Harper's face. Vargas hadn't just called in fake bomb threats on the other side of town to draw police away from the gala. He had planted a catastrophic secondary device right here. It was a fail-safe, a dead man's switch to cover his escape and destroy all forensic evidence. Evacuate the block! Harper roared into his radio mic, his voice cracking. Pull everyone back! Get the bomb squad up here right now! EOD is 22 minutes out, Lieutenant. The radio buzzed back, the perimeter officer sounding breathless. The digital timer on the casing, it says we have exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Absolute pandemonium erupted. Uniformed police officers began sprinting, physically grabbing bewildered civilians and shoving them away from the clubhouse, trying to get them behind the heavy, armored engine blocks of the fire trucks. Richard Belmont grabbed Cynthia by the waist, practically carrying her as they ran toward the street. But as Richard reached the edge of the police barricade, he looked over his shoulder. Vera wasn't running. She was kneeling on the asphalt, face to face with Kaiser. She ripped open a Velcro pouch on her tactical belt and pulled out a small, airtight plastic centrifuge tube. As a handler, she always carried scent-imprinting articles to keep the dog sharp. She unscrewed the cap, exposing a cotton swab infused with a trace chemical analog of RDX, the baseline molecular signature for C4 and military-grade plastic explosives. She held it to Kaiser's nose. He took one sharp, deep inhalation. Seek, she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute imperative. Kaiser didn't hesitate. The 90-pound dog spun around and sprinted directly back toward the dark, shattered entrance of the clubhouse, slipping right past 2 fleeing paramedics. Vera drew her captured Sig Sauer, handed back to her by Harper moments before, and sprinted right behind him. Jenkins, no! God damn it, stop! Harper yelled, lunging forward. But he was too late. They had already crossed the threshold into the dark. Inside the clubhouse, the emergency backup lights cast an eerie, strobing red glow across the ruined ballroom. The smell was overwhelming. Discharged gunpowder, metallic blood, spilled alcohol, and the sharp sulfur of broken drywall. To a human, it was a sensory overload. To a dog trying to isolate a single chemical compound, it was a nightmare. But Kaiser was a multi-purpose canine. He had tracked buried IEDs in the burning, oil-slicked streets of Fallujah. He operated on a level of olfactory genius that defied human comprehension. He didn't run aimlessly. He hit the main hallway and instantly dropped his nose an inch from the baseboards, his tail going perfectly rigid. He was slicing the pie, moving his head in tight, rapid zigzags to find the edges of the invisible scent cone wafting through the air currents. Ardin Sishawufen. Vera checked her watch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Find it, buddy." "Push," she urged quietly. Kaiser banked hard to the left, sliding on the polished hardwood, and slammed his front paws against the heavy steel door of the club's main electrical room. Vera kicked it open. The room was a maze of towering gray breaker boxes and thick conduit pipes. In the center of the room sat the obvious threat: a heavy black Pelican case, wires protruding from the latches, the red digital timer glowing ominously in the dark. Vera stepped toward it, but Kaiser physically blocked her. He stepped in front of her knees, letting out a sharp, frustrated whine. He didn't even look at the Pelican case. "A decoy," Vera breathed, realizing Vargas's twisted genius. He had left an obvious device for the police to find, knowing they would focus all their attention on it while the real bomb ticked away unseen. Kaiser ignored the case entirely and shoved his massive head into a narrow, dark 12-inch gap between the rear of the breaker cabinets and the load-bearing structural wall. He froze. He didn't bark. He didn't paw at the wall. He executed a perfect, rigid, textbook sit command. His nose was pointing exactly 2 inches from a piece of drywall that looked entirely, flawlessly normal. Vera squeezed into the gap behind him, clicking on a high-lumen tactical flashlight mounted to her pistol. She ran the beam over the drywall. It had been cleanly cut, set back into place, and hastily smeared with joint compound. "Edern Senschriffen, good boy." "Stay," she whispered. She holstered her weapon, drew her heavy, fixed-blade combat knife, and drove it brutally into the drywall seam. She wrenched the blade sideways, snapping the gypsum board, and ripped a 2-foot square panel out of the wall with her bare hands. Behind it, wired directly into the heavy brass valve of the country club's main commercial gas intake, was a terrifying sight. 2 pounds of gray, putty-like plastic explosive were molded tightly around the pipe. Embedded in the putty was a digital blasting cap. The timer wired to the cap read 1:14, but it wasn't just a timer. Vera recognized the secondary component immediately. It was a crude dead man's switch, wired to a modified cellular receiver. If Vargas didn't send a specific cancellation text from his encrypted burner phone, a phone the police had just confiscated, the circuit would automatically close when the timer hit 0. "Lieutenant," Vera said into her comms piece, having dialed Harper on an open line, "I have the actual device. The Pelican case is a dummy. The real one is plastered to the gas main behind a false wall. If this detonates, the fuel-air explosion takes out this entire block. The fire trucks won't shield you." "Get out of there, Vera! Fall back! We cannot defuse that in time!" Harper's voice was pure panic. Vera stared at the nest of wires. Red, blue, green, yellow. Hollywood movies made it look like a logic puzzle. Real bombs weren't puzzles. They were built by psychopaths, using whatever spare wire they had in their garage. Cutting the wrong wire could trigger an anti-tamper relay and blow them instantly. Lingdan Sishawufen. She looked down. Kaiser was sitting perfectly still in the red emergency light, his amber eyes locked onto her face. He trusted her implicitly. He had done his job. Now it was her turn. Vera took a slow, agonizingly deep breath, forcing her heart rate down. She couldn't cut the wires, but she knew how electricity worked. The cellular receiver needed power to close the final relay to the blasting cap. With 30 seconds left, she bypassed the tangled mess of wires entirely. She slid the razor-sharp edge of her combat knife flat behind the cellular receiver's small, taped-on lithium battery pack. Her hands were slick with sweat. If she slipped and crossed the conductive contacts with her steel blade, the spark would trigger the cap. Linden Scherbafen. She wedged the blade in. She gritted her teeth, braced her forearm against the concrete wall, and violently twisted the knife handle. With a sharp crack of breaking plastic and tearing electrical tape, she pried the battery pack completely off the circuit board. She ripped the connecting wires out by the roots, severing the power source physically and permanently. The red light on the detonator flickered frantically for a microsecond, and then died. The digital timer went completely blank. Linderlingsifen. The silence in the cramped electrical room was absolute, ringing in Vera's ears, broken only by Kaiser's steady, rhythmic panting. Vera dropped the knife. She collapsed backward, her spine hitting the cold concrete of the breaker boxes, and let her head loll back. Kaiser broke his rigid stay, army crawling the 2 feet over to her. He laid his heavy, massive head squarely on her chest, letting out a soft, high-pitched whine, nuzzling his wet nose under her chin. "I know, buddy," Vera whispered, her voice finally shaking as the adrenaline crash hit her like a freight train. She buried her hands deep into his thick sable fur, pulling him tight against her. "Me too." It took 4 days for the yellow police tape to finally come down around the Oakdale Country Club, but the invisible, suffocating barriers that had defined the neighborhood were already permanently shattered. The manicured lawns and the precise 2.5-inch grass suddenly felt profoundly trivial. The illusion of impenetrable, bought and paid-for suburban security had evaporated. Residents who previously only communicated through passive-aggressive neighborhood app posts were now stopping in the streets, asking about each other's children, and sharing the quiet, lingering trauma of a Tuesday afternoon that almost ended in mass casualties. Vera Jenkins was completely insulated from the neighborhood gossip. She sat on her back patio, the warm morning sun heating the wooden deck boards. Beside her lay Kaiser. His ribs were wrapped tightly in a stark, white, elastic compression bandage prescribed by the emergency trauma vet. The bruising from Richard's steel-shanked loafer was extensive, deep, angry purple tissue mottled beneath his sable coat, but the dog's spirit remained entirely untouched. He was lazily chewing on a heavy, black rubber Kong toy, occasionally letting out a soft grunt of satisfaction. Vera reached down, tracing the familiar, hairless scar on his shoulder and the notch missing from his left ear. A map of their shared survival. They had walked through the fire again, and they had come out the other side. The sharp chime of the doorbell broke the morning silence. Vera stood up. Kaiser immediately dropped his toy. Despite his bruised ribs, he pushed himself up with a slight limp and took his mandatory position directly at her left heel. Vera walked through the house and stopped at the front door. Through the reinforced glass pane, she saw Richard Belmont standing on her porch. He was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the bespoke Italian blazer, the perfectly coiffed hair, and the arrogant upward tilt of his chin. Richard wore a faded gray fleece pullover and a pair of wrinkled jeans. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full hour in 96 hours. His face was hollowed out, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion. He carried the heavy, inescapable physical weight of a man who had finally been introduced to his own cowardice and who knew he had survived only by the grace of the very creature he had despised. Vera opened the heavy wooden door, but she kept the metal security screen firmly latched. She didn't say a word. She crossed her arms and waited. Richard didn't try to force a smile. He didn't offer a legal defense or cite a single neighborhood bylaw. "I resigned," Richard said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual booming courtroom authority. It was a raspy, fragile whisper. From the HOA board, from the presidency, all of the committees. "I'm done." Vera leaned against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Because I'm a fool," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. He reached into the pocket of his fleece and pulled out a thick, standard white bank envelope. He slid it through the brass mail slot in the door. It dropped to the entryway floor. "That is not a bribe. And it isn't to buy absolution. Because I know I don't deserve it. It's a cashier's check made out directly to the United States War Dogs Association for $50,000. There is a second check in there to cover every single cent of his veterinary bills and his food for the rest of his life. Richard looked away from Vera. Slowly, deliberately, the wealthy, powerful corporate litigator dropped to one knee on the cold concrete porch. He lowered himself completely, putting his face at eye level with the German shepherd sitting behind the mesh screen. It was an ultimate, unconditional surrender of his ego. "I am so sorry," Richard whispered, the tears he had been fighting finally spilling over his lower lids. "I looked at you, and I only saw a monster because you didn't fit into my perfect, controlled little world. But the only monster on that patio was my own arrogance. You took a kick from me. You took my worst. And you still stood between a bullet and my wife. You saved her life. You saved my life." He held out an open, trembling hand toward the screen, palm up, vulnerable. Vera watched him. The combat-hardened ice in her chest thawed just a fraction. She reached out and unlatched the security screen, pushing it open a few inches. "Kaiser." "Frey," she commanded gently. "Free." Kaiser pushed the heavy door open with his nose. He stepped out onto the concrete porch, his claws clicking softly. He approached the kneeling man slowly. He didn't growl, but his posture was dominant and alert. He lowered his massive head, sniffing Richard's trembling hand. He smelled the salt of the tears, the sharp tang of lingering adrenaline, and the raw, unfiltered remorse radiating from the man. The massive dog let out a heavy, fluttering sigh through his nose. He gave Richard's open palm a single, rough lick with his tongue, and then turned around, trotting back inside the house to sit by Vera. "He forgives you, Richard," Vera said quietly, her voice devoid of its former lethality, "because that's what dogs do. But he doesn't forget, and neither do I. Use this second chance. Have a good life." She closed the door, the latch clicking with absolute finality. Richard Belmont was left alone on the porch, staring at the closed door. For the first time in his entire life, he felt completely insignificant, yet profoundly, deeply grateful just to be breathing. In the polished, insular world of Oakdale, appearances were everything until reality violently kicked the doors in. Richard Belmont learned the hardest lesson of his life. True discipline isn't about perfectly manicured lawns, enforcing petty rules, or controlling your neighbors. It is about the quiet, unyielding courage to stand in the breach when the world inevitably falls apart. Kaiser, a battle-scarred veteran with a titanium bite, didn't ask for a parade, gratitude, or recognition. He only asked for a handler who trusted him, operating on a frequency of loyalty that petty neighborhood tyrants could never initially comprehend. When the veneer of suburban safety was brutally stripped away, the very animal Richard deemed a menace became his ultimate, undeniable salvation. It stands as a stark, enduring reminder that real heroes rarely come dressed to impress. They come scarred, they come silent, and sometimes they come on four legs, ready to forgive the worst of humanity while fiercely protecting the best of it.